So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio.
Welcome. This weekend I went to the Women's March. I wanted to hear from individual participants firsthand why they were there and how far their support for abortion went. Unlimited access to abortion and so-called reproductive rights was the resounding echo of all the women I spoke to. I stood neutral during these interviews, but I found it fascinating how uncomfortable women were answering questions about late-term abortion in the face of my own growing baby bump at about 7 months now. Stay tuned. I'll share more with you a little later on, including firsthand interviews and my take on some of the responses, comments about men, the signs, the nasty hats, you name it, we'll discuss it. Welcome to Trending. This is our weekly happy hour here, and Father Tim Grumbach will be joining me in just a little bit to talk about our saints, the saints of the day, as well as St. Ignatius of Antioch, who we celebrated the feast day of this past weekend. What can the gruesome martyrdom of saints, teach us about joy and focusing on heaven? You might be surprised by the scandal that martyrdom and the cross can actually have, not only for society, but even for those of us who want to go to heaven. If you're just joining me, go ahead and give us a call. The number's 1-888-914-9149, or head over to my Instagram to ask your question you'd like to hear, whether a topic related to happiness or another topic discussed later this week. You can find me at Timmerie, that's Timmerie. One of the questions in light of this weekend's Women's March that came to mind, and we'll talk about the Women's March more later, is whether or not saying there's no difference between men and women has really made us happier. It was interesting talking to some of the women this weekend at the march, because part of the key dimension of the Women's March is focusing on so-called LGBTQ rights. But many of those rights focus on the obliteration of seeing there are any differences between men and women. But what was funny is when I talked to people, individual women, they acknowledge that they agree there are differences. However, they're concerned. They're concerned about patriarchy and misogyny, which we'll get to later. But let's talk a little bit about what this whole discussion over saying there are no differences between men and women, or perhaps we could even say by neutering women through abortion and contraception, what has this done? It's actually been quite the paradox. There was a journal that came out, or an article that was published in 2009 in the American Economic Journal. It was publishing a study of a 35-year-long study with data and research showing that women's happiness has actually plummeted. Women reported a decline in general happiness lower than men. Now, this contrasts studies conducted in years prior, such as in the 60s, when social change had not yet affected the sexes as such, and women reported being happier than men. That was just 60 years ago. The study showed how ironic and disheartening it is, actually. There's evidence of the decline of feminine happiness when women's education status has heightened. Women's wage gap has closed in, and women are no longer bound by their fertility. These are all the things that women wanted: education, closing the wage gap, and no longer being bound by fertility. Well, they got it. But it would seem that the bandage of so-called liberation only covered the wound and never really healed the hurt and confusion that women are still facing today. Hence, we have the Women's March. Women are still complaining. Women are still upset, and we'll get to that a little later on. But what about men? We've seen this astronomical increase in the suicide rate of young men who should be thriving in their careers, young millennials. Yet we've seen instead a perpetual sense of adolescence. They're actually struggling in their careers. Many of them find themselves alone, anxious, and depressed, which is part of what's leading to this higher suicide rate. We're seeing what St. Edith Stein, St. Teresa Benedict of the Cross, often referred to as an atrophy of the human person. You see, when there's not this complementarity of men and women and the different dimensions that we bring, the human person will atrophy. She actually even talks about this, how it'll happen within the work environment. It will happen within the home. If who a woman is suppressed, and who a man is suppressed, then how we interact with one another, how we complement each other, how we grow in generosity and understanding of the world and its problems is actually impacted in a very significant way. You see, when we are fed and are willingly jumping on the bandwagon to represent causes that say that there are no differences between men and women, we're actually accepting a lie about creatures, about us, the creatures that God created. He chose to create us out of an absolute act of love. He didn't have to create us. We weren't necessary. But not only did he create us, but he created us to be with him in heaven one day. Now, he created us in an act of love, which is why he gave us intellect and free will. He's willing to let us not be with him, because it wouldn't be loving for him to force us to follow all of his commandments and live in a perfect way in order to be with him. Now, it makes sense that we would need to have this purification of who we are and what we do in order to be with God, because God is perfect. And in order for us to live in eternal beatitude with him, there needs to be this purification, hint, hint, purgatory, that will help us to get there. If, that is, we die without those big sins, right? Mortal sins still weighing on our conscience and as unconfessed. See, when we lie about who we are and what we're created for, all sorts of things tend to fall into utter chaos. In fact, we knew this from the beginning. If you just walk back to Genesis chapter 1 and 2, God told the creation story pretty darn clearly. He first, in Genesis chapter 1, created man and woman at the same time, because he's trying to explain an anthropological understanding of who we are. We're creating God's image and likeness, making very clear the equality between the sexes, but the complementarity. But then Genesis chapter 2, God has a story told again, and this time he creates Adam first and Eve second, showing the necessity of Eve for Adam and vice versa, the complementarity between the two, and the joy that having one for the other brings. We know in Genesis chapter 2, we read that Adam was alone in the garden when he was the only human person. And there was a sense of awe that was inspired in him when Eve was brought about. This awe that brought about an even greater dimension of who he was and the complementarity and growth that developed between the two individuals. Now, if you go just a little further to Genesis chapter 3, sin comes into the picture, and what happens? A result of the fall and sin is that one will strike at the heel, the other will strike at the head. The communication, the interaction, that growth between male and female has been damaged. The cooperation, the love, even just understanding each other. We talk about how the original state of unity, the union of the two, male and female, has gone away. That original sense of nakedness. Remember, Adam and Eve were butt naked in the garden. They had no problem with it because there was such a profound sense of innocence. They did not objectify one another in their nakedness. All of these elements of the original unity and state of the garden, even that original solitude, points to the importance of God creating us as a male and female. And as we dive further into our topics today on trending, you'll see how important this is, even in talking about our saints and the sacrifices that were made by them. Joining me here is Father Tim Grumbach. Father Tim will join me to discuss the saints of the day and how the scandal of the cross is actually a path to great joy. Again, you're joining us during my happy hour here on Trending. If you want to hear about the marriage hour, just join me every Thursday. That's coming up. Father Tim Grumbach is the associate pastor at St. Augustine Parish in the Diocese of Los Angeles. He volunteers with many programs, including Young Catholic Professionals, Life Teen, and others. Father Tim, thank you for joining me today.
As always, it's so good to be here. It feels like it's been a little while, so it's good to be back.
It has. You've been out of the state, I think, even since we last spoke.
Yeah, even while we were last chatting, I was actually over in Savannah in Georgia with my family, and it was such a delightful time to be with them. But now I'm back to work, and if you want to call it work. But we have our Saturdays used to be so quiet around here during the COVID lockdown, but we're finally getting back into our sacramental masses for all of our First Communion kids. So far, the last 2 Saturdays, we've had 3 masses for First Communions alone each day, and then the regular masses and regular confessions. And so, then we got confirmations coming up next month. It's we're coming back to life here at the parish, so it's good to be back.
You're back on mission there at the church, and that reminds me of the topic I wanted to discuss. So often, living the Christian life feels so difficult. And in fact, to live a Christian life almost seems like failure in the face of the world. And so I wanted to talk during our Happiness Hour about how there is joy when we live faithfully to the mission that God has given us, even in the face of worldly failure. And I think a perfect example of this are the saints of today. Can you share with us a little bit about today's saints that we focus on, who were in fact missionaries to the Americas?
Oh yes, today is the Feast of the American Martyrs, or the North American Martyrs, or the Canadian Martyrs, however you want to call them. They were French Jesuit priests, for the most part, who came over to what is now the United States and Canada. At the time, they called it New France. And so they were going to a new land, a new part of the world that they knew very little about. And so they were leaving their families behind. They were leaving their lives behind. And they were going out seeking, yes, to preach the gospel and to bring people to Christ. But they were coming pretty much knowing that they were going to their martyrdom. And so one of my favorite of the saints that we celebrate today is St. Isaac Jogues. And he was a young man who became a Jesuit and was so excited to come here to North America that he says that when he arrived and celebrated his first Mass in the New World, he said, I don't know what heaven is like, but I would compare it to this. That was his excitement to be able to give his life that way, to come into a place that he had never been, had never really imagined, but that he knew that he was coming where Christ desired him to be, but more importantly for him, where he can be conformed to the image of Christ on the cross and ultimately face his own martyrdom.
Now, he and the other companions who were martyred didn't really see the fruit of their missionary zeal. In fact, the world might look at them and say, wow, they kind of had a lot of failings. They didn't really get to see any of the progress in their evangelization of the Native Americans.
Right, and there was a lot of miscommunication and misunderstanding during the first years of their time preaching the gospel and sharing the faith and bringing people into the church. And a lot of that had to do with the complicated political situation, not just between France and the Native Americans, but the Native Americans among themselves, so that these missionaries would come in and they would be treated poorly because some of the traders and settlers had come in and had brought diseases with them that the Native Americans did not have any immunity to, or they would bring violence and a way of life that they didn't understand with them, so that when the missionaries came in, they took a lot of the brunt of that misunderstanding and miscommunication, and honestly, violence and cruelty in some ways. But then the people began to know them because missionaries like St. Isaac Jogues desired to live among the people, not to be like, oh, here, I'm coming from a better world to drop in some gifts among you. But they knew they had to learn the languages, they had to learn the customs, while maintaining their Christian identity and bringing people into the church rather than simply diving into the culture and getting lost in it. They knew they weren't natives, but they knew they were missionaries, and they had to be more than just people who dropped gifts in and left. They had to be people who entered into the culture and made friends, made relationships, because what better vehicle for the gospel is there than friendship? But you're right, there was a lot of failure in those early years, And it even led to St. Isaac Jogues being caught up in the midst of a real political problem between the French and the Native Americans, as well as the Iroquois and the Huron tribes. He was staying with the Hurons, got captured by some Iroquois, and was able to hide for a little bit, but then realized he wasn't there to hide. So he came out of his hiding place, was caught by the Iroquois, and eventually tortured along with some of the other Native Americans and missionaries. And they ended up, to cut the most gruesome of the details, they cut off his thumb and his forefinger on his left hand so that he would not be able to celebrate Mass, because by church law, the only way that a priest could offer Mass was by holding the host with those two fingers.
Right.
And so he had to get a special dispensation from the Pope himself when he returned to France after being able to escape to be able to celebrate Mass. And the Pope at the time said, this is a living martyr that we have here. And so he was already recognized for his sanctity, even though he wasn't seeing a lot of fruit from his ministry. And so this is the most incredible thing about not seeing the fruit from your ministry and your missionary work, but that it conforms you to Christ, who died on the cross. It conforms you to all the saints and the martyrs who've gone before, who may not have seen even the miraculous fruit of their ministry, is that the man who killed St. Isaac Jogues, so the story goes, was himself captured by another tribe and was set up for execution. While he was waiting to be killed, he was baptized by another missionary priest. And guess what the name is that he took as his Christian name? Father Isaac Jogues. And so in a certain sense, Saint Isaac Jogues was martyred twice, at least by name. And in that sense, that even the man he killed, or who killed him, what became a Christian at the moment of his own death, took his name. And can you imagine St. Isaac Jogues welcoming that man into heaven, the man who had killed him? I mean, that's right out of the gospel. That's right out of the Acts of the Apostles. Can you imagine St. Stephen welcoming St. Paul through the gates of heaven at that moment? And so, though we may not see the fruits of our missionary and ministerial works, the saints and the martyrs remind us that it's sometimes not for us to see, to think that it's our work being done, but it was for God's to work in his time. We want to see it sometimes, but we don't always get to. And that's one of the most important lessons that the martyrs have to teach us.
That's Father Tim Grumbach. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie, heard here on Relevant Radio. Wow, looking at St. Isaac Jogues and Companions, I mean, these were men who were blamed, mutilated, tortured, and ultimately martyred. It would be so easy at any point of their journey to almost fall into this state of hopelessness or even despair. The missionary work that I'm doing, the fact that I've traveled across the world, nothing is coming about that is fruitful. I'm being blamed, tortured, mutilated. Yet at the same time, they went all the way. They took themselves all the way to that martyrdom that was given to them. This is the scandal of the cross that Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI has talked about, and which was so scandalous to people in the early church. They couldn't understand how this man who was crucified, this failure in their eyes, could be the God who would save them.
Right, and the way that Pope Emeritus Benedict would write about the scandal of the cross, the scandalon, right, that Greek word that means a stumbling block, as St. Paul would write that the cross is a scandalon, a stumbling block to the Jews, that their Messiah would be crucified naked and as a criminal, that was not how he was supposed to end. That cross was a stumbling block, but ultimately was the revelation of God's love and what actually enacted it and continues to do so on every altar in a Catholic church throughout the world, that the scandal is that the Messiah became a particular person in a particular place, that God incarnate became one of us in all things but sin, but that what was most certainly one of the heaviest things on Pope Benedict's heart throughout his ministry, and I'm sure continues to be through his life of prayer and penance now, is the scandals that were going through the church. And that extremely heavy burden that he must have had as Pope to deal with it in a just and merciful way, but also to root out that evil in the church and to get credit sometimes, blame at other times, but knowing that that scandal gets in the way of the scandal of the cross is the true tragedy, but that we can't erase that unless we erase the church and the martyrs and the saints.
This is part of the message to us Christians. There's transformation that takes place in the face of trial. We'll be right back to discuss this more with Father Tim Grumbach here on Trending with Timmerie.
Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
Have a question during the show? Would you like to join our weekly happy hour here on Trending? Head over to my Instagram. You can follow me at Timmerie, that's Timmerie, or give me a call at 1-888-914-9149. My guest today is Father Tim Grumbach, and we're talking about the joy of staying on mission. That is the mission to direct ourselves toward the heavenly kingdom, following the laws, the precepts, the commandments that God gave us, even in the face of worldly failure. Now, we spoke of today's saints, but I want to talk now about finding joy in martyrdom. St. Ignatius of Antioch died around the year 107, and he was a willing sacrifice and wrote incredibly brave words. In fact, he died in Rome in an amphitheater after being fed to the lions, allegedly. Yet, while he was facing this, basically, similar to the gladiatorial games, I'm not sure that he was actually fed in the Colosseum, but he was fed in the amphitheaters there in Rome. While he was being escorted from Antioch to Rome, he wrote 7 letters. And Father Tim Grumbach from St. Augustine Parish in the Diocese of Los Angeles is with me now. We're going to discuss some of the writings from these very profound letters while he's preparing for his ultimate martyrdom.
Right. And it's so great that we can talk about this joy of the cross and this happiness during this happy hour, because I felt like I maybe took the air out of the sails a little bit for a lot of our First Communion families and baptism families during the weekend, because I had to preach about St. Ignatius of Antioch.
And these great quotes.
Yeah. Oh, the great image he gives, like, I am the wheat of God, and I'm going to be ground between the teeth of the animals to become the pure bread of Christ. And it's so perfect for First Communions and baptisms and the sacraments, because, first of all, we believe that the sacraments came from the very open heart of Christ on the cross, that the water for baptism flowed out and the blood of the Eucharist flowed out, and that the church is born from the side of Christ as Eve was born from the side of Adam in his deep sleep. So that when we get to these First Communion masses and these baptism masses, that we can look to someone like St. Ignatius, who not only knew to receive the body and blood of Christ, but could see in his own martyrdom that he was becoming the body and blood of Christ, that he was this wheat of God that was to become the bread of Christ. And so the Eucharist wasn't something that he was receiving, it was something that he was doing, something that he was becoming. And so to be able to share that with our First Communion families, I don't know what their reaction was, honestly, but I couldn't help myself, because I remember a few years ago being able to help out at a First Communion Mass, and it just really convicting my heart to look upon these children from 2nd grade to 5th grade to 8th grade, these children who we've taught them how to receive communion. Get your hands like a throne for Jesus, and make the sign of the cross. And, we taught them how to receive communion, but I really hope that our teachers and our church was teaching them to become the body and blood of Christ, like St. Ignatius, maybe not in the same way. You know what? Why do we always make that disclaimer? Like, God's probably not going to call you to a red martyrdom. I'm like, why not? All of the greatest saints, whether they were martyrs or not, had this great desire to become martyrs, become red martyrs. Look at Saint Therese of Lisieux. She had this great desire to go and preach to the Muslims, and expected some kind of martyrdom through the process. But though it's what she wanted, it wasn't what God called her to. But then we're almost trying to make excuses in a way, like, no, it's okay if you don't want that, because what God really wants from you is a white martyrdom. I'm like, how do we know unless we ask? How do we know unless we set it in our hearts to be red martyrs? Can you imagine the kind of love that the world would see from any Christian, but especially from Catholics, if our sole desire was to so unite ourselves to Christ on the cross that we would go to any length to tell people about Jesus, any length even to die for Jesus, even if that's not exactly what he's calling us to. I just I get so worked up on that when we approach the sacraments, that we have this fear that it won't be for our good. We have this fear that right. that God is going to like punish us. We have this fear that instead of drawing us to himself through our sufferings, that somehow
isolated.
That somehow God is, he's not really calling you to that greatness. So come up with something else. I don't know. but to share the story of St. Ignatius with these young children and with their families, it's something we have to do as a church, because again, First Communion is not just something that you do, it's something that you become.
Well, and I look at it, Father Tim, and I think we are called to joyful union with God. Happiness is an emotion. It's fleeting. It's passing, just like anger, just like anxiety, just like, we could talk about giddiness. Happiness comes and goes, but joy is this underlying union with God. It's a virtue. It's that no one can take this profound sense of peace and joy away from me. It goes deeper than happiness. And so I think of joy in union with God, both on earth and in heaven. And it's so clearly seen in these 7 letters as St. Ignatius of Antioch is preparing to be fed to the lions in Antioch. And you mentioned part of this quote, but this one that stands out to me so clearly is that he's joyfully looking to this martyrdom. He says, "Let me be food for the wild beasts, for they are my way to God." And who says that? Like, I get to go and be with God, and yes, like, he's asking for prayers that he can get there and actually make this sacrifice, but who says that? Let me be food for the wild beasts, for they are my way to God.
Could you imagine if our bishops wrote that way? Again, that's something that comes to my mind a lot, is when people are saying, they look at the certain decisions that bishops have made and the protocols that are in place for quarantine and whatnot, and they say, the bishop's this, the bishop's that, when the bishops don't really have any real authority over me. My bishop does. And so am I praying and supporting my bishop, and am I desiring that he have this kind of love for his people, and at someday may be able to write a letter like this to us. Right. Not that I'm desiring my bishop be carted away by the authorities and fed to animals, by no means. It's what I would love to see any bishop write a letter with this much intensity and love for his people and for Christ.
And for those who don't know, St. Ignatius was a bishop of Antioch for 40 years, actually, before he was martyred. And so when Father Tim was saying, I wish my bishop would write to me like that. Well, that's what St. Ignatius was doing. He was writing to his people, to his flock, asking for their prayers. And it's fascinating as we read, as he continues to go on, he says, "My desire is to belong to God. Do not then hand me back to the world." And he goes on to say, "Let me attain pure light. Only on my arrival there, that is heaven, can I be fully a human being."
Yeah, he also writes that no earthly pleasures and no kingdoms of this world can benefit me in any way. So he knows that the world is created good by God, and he knows that we're meant to do what we can to eradicate poverty in front of us. He knows all these things that we wrestle with still today. But he has this proper relationship with the world. He says, "I'm going to God. I've done everything I can, and there's nothing more that I can do." And he pleads with the Romans, "Please don't stop this. This is what God asks of me." And so just the intensity, the prayer, and the love with which he writes, I hope that every bishop would be able to write in a similar situation, but even now, write with that same love and that same intensity for his people, to let them know what is the most important thing. Is the most important thing your safety and your health, or is the most important thing the salvation of your souls and your conformity to Christ on the cross, and so to his resurrection?
I look at this example of a saint, a bishop, and it reminds me of that quote. Is it St. Ignatius who says, "For the glory of God is the living man, and the life of man is the vision of God"? Like, we are who we were created to be when we are united to God, living as the creatures that he created us to be. And this reminds me, Father Tim, of the beginning of the show. I was talking about, well, are we really happier as human beings now by saying there are no differences between men and women and writing into law things that try to force us to say that there are no differences? The matter of the fact is, we're not happier because of it. We're happier when we follow that vision God had for us and how he created our bodies, our minds, and souls to be united to him. And part of that journey includes the complementarity of men and women.
Right. And I think it was St. Irenaeus writing that, the glory of God is man alive. It's somehow the translation, people use is man fully alive. I don't know where that came in, but I don't think that's in his original language. But the glory of God is man alive, and then it's the vision of God is the glory of man. And you know what, I've noticed this, just watching you be so brave as to go down to the Women's March and to speak into that culture, is that we have a great desire for these people to experience full life, to experience the life that God has prepared for them. And so we love them, and that's why we challenge them. But I don't get the sense from the other side of things, generally speaking, I'm maybe oversimplifying, but it really seems that the other side of things that is pro-abortion, that is part of this culture of death, is that they're not trying to sway our minds because they love us. But that's what we have to get into our hearts, is to be reminded we're not just trying to be right, but we're trying to love. And we're trying to invite these people into that full life, into the glory of God. Because God can't receive more glory than he already has, but it magnifies us to glorify God. Not because he's selfish and just wants attention, but because he made us for his glory, to reveal the love that he has had with the Son in the Holy Spirit from all of eternity. That's what we're made for. And when we come up against people who disagree with us concerning the culture of life and the culture of death, who's loving best? Are we loving them into the truth, or are they hating us into doubt? I don't know if it's that black and white, but that's what I've been thinking, is that we must approach these conversations and these conversions from a place of love, because we desire people to have that vision of God and to live fully.
Father Tim Grumbach here on Trending with Timmerie, heard on Relevant Radio. What you've said, Father Tim, reminds me of this question I've had when talking about St. Ignatius of Antioch and his martyrdom, being fed to the beasts in Rome. I think of our own willingness to cooperate with God. And can that willingness to cooperate with God really bring about a greater joy in our life, even if we'll face persecution?
Well, the cross says yes. Yes. Yeah. It's true. And I think it is true, because it's something, I think a lot of people who have been involved in the pro-life movement have seen this face-to-face confrontation between good and evil. Yet at the same time, the challenge of every person who is pro-life is to love the other person. I have to say, I posted a photo from the Women's March sharing a little bit about why I was there, what I was sharing, and there was this massive debate that broke out on one of the comments on my Instagram, and I was really amazed. One woman, basically there was this accusation, you pro-life people are pro-birth, not pro-life. And, you're not there to take care of the child after it's born. And I saw one woman very quickly respond and say, actually, that's not true. And she gives the example of a crisis pregnancy center and gives a link to an Instagram page of one of the centers. And that woman kind of calmed down. She said, wow, that's incredible. I don't think it's something she had ever seen. Yet other people jumped into this conversation, Father Tim, and I know you and I hate these Instagram social media battles, and they attacked her. Rather than maybe reading that chain of comments and seeing there was some headway being made with this person, instead it almost turned into ad hominem attacks, rather than seeing this is someone who is clearly reaching out to want to see what we have to say. Yeah, the medium of Instagram or Twitter, whatever it may be, does not always lend itself to the best of conversations. But when you see that it's happening, that's a grace of the Holy Spirit, and it's, not by our work alone that happens.
When we have an eternal perspective on life, it directs our emotions, it directs the context of situations we find ourselves in, and it gives us this greater sense of peace, an ultimate joyfulness in the mission of God, that we are called to live in trying times, but we can find great joy even in the face of any experience we might go through. That's Father Tim Grumbach. He's back on social media. I'll tag him on social media so you can follow him, specifically on Instagram. We'll be right back talking about my experience this weekend at the Women's March.
Timmerie will be right back. You can reach her on Instagram and Twitter at Timmerie. That's Timmerie. We're talking about what you're thinking about. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
Okay, so I went to the Women's March. That is one of the local marches here in Southern California, in San Diego. And I have to tell you, I thought about it on Friday, and I shared with you, my assumption was this. There was going to be a stark contrast between the Women's March of 2020, this weekend, and the Women's March of 2017, the first one. The difference would be this. Back in 2017, a vast majority of women who weren't even pro-abortion wanted to be at that march. Many marched believing that they were there just to be pro-woman. Many women mourned the fact that they didn't get the opportunity to participate. Now, as the years have gone by, people understand, actually, some of the key pillars of the Women's March are A, unfettered access to abortion, LGBTQ rights, so-called reproductive rights, including specifically contraception. So my guess was people who were at the Women's March would be there in smaller numbers, but they would know why they were there. That is really for abortion. And so I showed up at the Women's March, and I wanted to interview people, me being from a completely neutral perspective. Why are you here? Not only did I ask them, why are you here, but given their responses that they were there because of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, because of the Supreme Court, in opposition to the possible election of a pro-life president, being President Donald Trump, they were there for all of these reasons. It all centered around abortion. And so my question came back saying, well, it sounds as if you're very concerned about Roe versus Wade being overturned. And they said, absolutely. That was why they were there. So I'm going to share with you a little bit some of the audio and the conversations I had with people about what Roe v. Wade is, the access to it, the fact that it makes abortion legal through all 9 months of women's pregnancy. But I want to share with you a little bit about the atmosphere of the Women's March first. I'll share with you, everyone was completely polite to me in the conversations I had. I think everyone assumes that they were fighting and angry. Well, they weren't. They thought they were among their own people, and so they were there in their safety net. So there wasn't that level of hostility that some might have expected. Now, second, the truth of the matter is they're still wearing those nasty hats. I could not believe it. I mean, I will not say that half of the people had those nasty hats on, but I would say a good quarter of the women had those nasty hats on. And I'm talking young and old. Boomer down to your Gen X had nasty hats. And I really just wanted to ask someone about their nasty hat. I guess I didn't really think about it. And I probably couldn't have remained neutral asking that question, to be really honest. So I didn't go there. But next time, if there's a next time, maybe I will. Now, at the same time, I posted images. I'll post more. I posted a lot this weekend on my story. But a lot of the photos continue to be full of nasty signs that you just wouldn't want to read. And you really think, couldn't we have better marketing here? Couldn't we have a better message to share with people other than talking about our body parts so vulgarly that we ultimately are objectifying ourselves? That's what I saw. Now, the other dimension that was fascinating to me from being at the Women's March this weekend was the leadership. So they actually only expected about 300 people in San Diego at their march. Well, about 10 minutes before it's all supposed to start, there's supposed to be some opening remarks before the march. The organizer, who I'm just going to throw it out there, was a very condescending boomer who snapped at people to get in line, who snapped at people when people said they couldn't hear her, and she yelled at them to move closer. And she said, well, I expected more people, and if everyone's not here, I'm just going to cancel the march. So I just want to let you know, I may just call the march in 10 minutes. She was very, very aggressive. And I'm thinking, lady, if anyone heard you right now, and that was their invitation to come, they would be out of here. Well, 5 minutes before we're supposed to start, she comes back on her bullhorn again and said, I think I'm just going to call the march. I'll let you know in 5 minutes. Stay tuned. Then your stereotypical pro-abortion looking millennial, I'm just going to say it's a total stereotype, social justice warrior comes marching up next to her. And she's like trembling. She's so upset. And she says, well, if she's not going to march with us, I will lead us, okay? And then all of a sudden, the Women's March participants, maybe 150 or so, start cheering. Okay, so the next thing you know, they're in this little powwow, and they're discussing what's going to happen. And let's just say the condescending boomer is talking about just leaving. I'm not kidding. This was totally entertainment for me. So next thing you know, the boomer takes off, and now the new stereotypical millennial social justice warrior gets up there on her bullhorn that she brought, and she shares, okay, so I'm going to lead you in the march. We're still going to do this. However, I just really need to gather my thoughts and emotions. I just need a few minutes. So just give me 10 or 20 minutes and then I'll have some remarks to share with you before we start. This is real. This is real life. This was the Women's March. Now, next thing you know, Xena Warrior Princess comes up. She comes running up to her and she says, I can help you. I can speak if you want. I'm comfortable speaking in front of a crowd. Okay, I'm sorry. I have to describe to you what Xena Warrior Princess looked like. She was basically wearing underwear with lacy things dangling down. Like she was in lingerie, okay? This was the representation of the Women's March. We started with a condescending boomer, a stereotypical, emotionally triggered social justice warrior pro-abortion individual. Then we have Xena Warrior Princess in lingerie. And she's the one who gives the opening remarks. I have to set this context for you because the emotional atmosphere was unbelievable. The lack of leadership, and in fact, the lack of ownership and self-confidence was out the door. And this is one of the predictions I made to you on Friday. Not even a prediction, it was a reminder. Remember, those who support the Women's March and those who are there are often very post-abortive individuals. People who are so emotionally wrapped up with the issue of abortion. This was specifically why I went in this circumstance neutral, because I wanted to hear what they had to say. But I also knew if we pricked the pear a little too quickly, it could implode and it could turn into a hostile environment because emotions were running high. So I want to share with you now some of the audio from being there at the Women's March, now that we've set the atmosphere. So the first few women I interviewed, it was actually 3 generations of women represented. The grandmother, the adult daughter, and the now 18-year-old granddaughter. Now, when interviewing the mother of the youngest girl, we were talking about whether or not Roe v. Wade should be considered again. And we're talking about how it's legal through all 9 months of a woman's pregnancy. Listen to this. If Roe v. Wade is reconsidered, do you think that there should be any sort of restriction placed on abortion?
Again, I don't know that I have the information to answer that because I'm not a medical specialist, but I do believe that women should have the right to choose, and there are various different reasons that a woman might choose to enter pregnancy at any point. We can't say that we're going to we care about life, but then we only care about certain lives, and a life in utero should not have more value than a black man on the street who's getting shot down for nothing. So I guess I have to look at it like that.
I'm sorry, but Floyd has nothing to do with this. Can I just say that? Someone who's been shot on the street has nothing to do with us talking about abortion in this instance. So let's just set that aside for a moment. Do you notice the fact that she can't even answer, okay, if we reconsider abortion, I even said before this, Roe v. Wade's legal through all 9 months of women's pregnancy. Do you think at any point we should change that? That there should maybe be restrictions later on? No, they want unfettered access. But she's not willing to give specific medical examples of how that would be necessary in a second or third trimester. Almost everyone I spoke to wanted it accessible in the second and third trimester. However, they tried to give these big picture crisis type of situations where abortion would be necessary, yet they couldn't really put their finger on one. Now, here's what's interesting. I want you to hear from her millennial, or not even millennial, Gen Z daughter who's 18 years old, is able to vote now. Why is she there? Listen to this. You're a third generation marcher. Why are you here today?
Well, this is my first year that I'm able to vote, so I just feel like it's really cool that I have my mom and my grandma that are like encouraging me to come out and march and like practice my civil rights. So I think it's really important. I also just feel like my generation, we want to change things, and so I think that it's important to get involved early, so that's just what I'm trying to do.
This makes me ask the question, what kind of examples are we giving to young women? Because she's clearly inspired by her mother and her grandmother, which is an incredible thing, but what type of inspiration should a young woman receive today? Because she looks to the women who are older than her. And she even says, my generation wants to change things. So she's looking to her formation to guide what she will change. And this brings up an important point. Many young women only have the models of social media and the teachers they have in their education system. And those are the people who they're listening to. Now, if they have their parents who are more involved, which isn't very common in today's culture, they're going to follow often what those parents give as a model and example for them. And so it's a reminder that what we show as a model of femininity and women in the culture is so important, because these young people want to make a change in the world. Now, you're listening to Trending with Timmerie. I was at the Women's March this weekend interviewing people. One of the questions I asked had to do with access to abortion. Now, this woman insisted that in order to be a citizen, she needed that access.
Our sisters are here to preserve a fundamental right that without access to abortion and family planning, I won't feel like a real citizen of this country. I will feel like African Americans before civil rights. And so I think that if I had to choose one, that would be it.
Are you kidding me? Do you know what African Americans went through before having rights in this nation? The impact of segregation? The fact that even before that, a person of color was considered 3/5 of a human being? These people were tortured and murdered. I'm sorry, but you not having access to abortion does not mean that you are less of a citizen. It's incredibly naive and narrow-minded, and this comes back to my last point about what sort of role models are we showing to women today? Because women are being fed the lie that they need abortion in order to be educated, have a career, or plan their own family. That's a lie that women are being told. You can't be a woman unless you have, quote, reproductive rights, abortion and contraception on demand. But what's sad is that with this, we're saying you have to be a neutered version of yourself, ladies, in order to participate in society. And I think that that's a closer comparison to a civil rights issue than someone not having access to abortion. In fact, women are becoming more the slave by being told they have to neuter their bodies and kill their children in order to be a functioning member of society, in order to be a citizen. And so, what should our message be to people who wish they could support the Women's March? You don't need abortion or contraception in order to be equal with a man, to have a career, be educated, or have a family. Women really do deserve better than the lasting physical, emotional, and psychological impact that abortion has. We need to remember to offer resources for post-abortion healing, because this is who represents the Women's March. So be sure to recommend resources such as Rachel's Hope and Healing, which we'll share in the show notes today. Just head over to relevantradio.com/trending.